Scope management is the first detail of the process. So we talked about integration management being the high level, but scope management is that first detail. It's the first knowledge area where we actually get into the details, and there's a lot of work that has to be done in it. So basically, scope management is basically the process that we do to ensure that the project includes all and only the work that is required. Notice I said all and only the work. All right. And reason being is we're setting a boundary around the project, right? We want to make sure that things fall in scope, or if they're out of scope, we're not doing them. And it's important, even in Agile, that you have some type of scope around it, so people understand the project, right? So that's key there. And see here it's even highlights. Whoops, trying to highlight. Includes all of the work necessary to complete the project successfully. And I'm saying all and only the work, meaning we're going to be controlling it through change control process, whether it is in a predictive or agile environment. We have a process of how we're going to control it. Even in an agile, when somebody makes a request to the product backlog, sometimes we have to look at it. It says, does this particular request, even though we're adding it to the product backlog, does it really fit to what we're doing? And we have to prioritize the product backlog. And that's key, right? So there's still some type of scope. You can't just add something. You're building a building and you decided, hey, we're going to include a laundromat. It's kind of off the scope of what you're trying to do, because you're trying just to build a generic building versus somebody saying, hey, let's make into a laundromat. I know that's a little extreme example, but hopefully you get the example. All
On
right, so
on the
yeah.
scopes, would you
Hmm.
ever prioritize them, or are they all or nothing? To go with your laundry map, let's say the building also wanted a gym. So the
Hmm.
building's the priority. You've then got a toss-up between a laundromat and a gym because of some cost constraint that came in later. Would all three of those be listed as a scope? Build the building, build a gym, build a laundromat, or is it possible to have stretch scopes as stretch goals?
You can have, it depends on the change control, right? As if you're going to include that. But if, let's say those items, the laundromat and the gym, were included in the building, that we're going to build those out somewhere in the building. All right, so and we've said that's part of scope. So yes, they could be part of scope if that's identified it. If somewhere down the line and you're working and you set your scope, you set your boundaries already, and then somebody goes, hey, let's make this into a laundromat, that would have to go through the integrated change control process to add it to scope, versus that, um, it, we could say, no, that's out of scope. We're just building a building, right? So, does that make sense? So it could be part of it if that's what you guys scoped out. But once you set scope, and somebody goes, hey, let's build a laundromat, you could actually say, well, that's out of scope for this project.
So it's never to prioritize. You never prioritize scopes.
No, you can. No, like in the product backlog in an agile environment, we may have a list of requirements, and we would prioritize those requirements based off of what's the need at that time.
Okay.
So let's say,
Could you have a nice to have scope then just on a backlog? That
right, exactly. And one of the biggest problems we all face is that when we ask folks what are their priorities, the highest priorities, they say everything is, right? That's one of the biggest problems we see, and we have to say, we can't do everything, so we need to prioritize what is the most important items that have to be done right now. So let's say, uh, we have they want to build the laundromat and the gym, but we can't build the laundromat and gym at the same time, and maybe the budget doesn't allow it, so we have to go, okay, which one's more important? Is the gym more important or is the laundromat? So that, those are decisions on scope.
Right.
Yeah. Sometimes in projects our budget gets cut, and then guess what? Guess what happens? We cut some of the scope out because there's no way to cut budget. I mean, we get rid of some people off the project, but usually it's scope. If they're going to slash our budget, then we need to go, okay, well, here's the things that are the most highest priority for you, and these things are not. Can we remove those from scope? So, I mean, it's a way to negotiate. So, does that make sense? Okay.
Yes, thank you.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so the project scope management, as you can see here, is the process required for all and only the work that we said we're going to do. And if change happens, we'll do that modern controlling, but we're trying to set, like I said, a boundary. We don't want something that's not aligned with our company, that's not aligned with our project objectives to be added to our project. For instance, we're working on Medicare Part D project objectives, and somebody comes in and goes, you know what, can you guys add some Humana work on this, which is an insurance company, by the way, and we're like, no, we're only working on Medicare Part D. I mean, it's kind of out of the scope and it doesn't work, but they'll say, but it's similar, and it's like, no, but Humana is different, we're only focusing on that. So you could have that pushback when you have your boundaries, right? If you don't have your boundaries and you don't have no scope document, guess what happens? People add that to it, and it just grows and grows and grows and grows. So it's important to have some type of boundary around your scope, even in agile projects. Even though, as I stated, we welcome change, but we still have to keep in alignment what the project's about. All right, so you can see here the process is, you see that there's 6 items. We have plan scope. It's actually plan scope management. We have collect requirements. We have define scope, create UWBAS. All of those I just mentioned, those first 4, are in the planning process group. And then we have validate scope and control scope, and that's in modern controlling. So for now, we've been talking about projects going from initiating, planning, executing, modern controlling, and closing. And now that we get into the knowledge areas, we can see that even though we're focusing on scope, we may be in planning, but we also may be in modern controlling. All right, so just kind of keep it in mind, even though we're talking about scope management and in the detail, keep in mind it's still in the frame of doing the project in order: initiating, planning, executing, modern controlling, and closing, even though we're talking specifically about scope management. So just kind of keep that in mind, because I know it sometimes gets confusing when we start getting into the details and I go, now we're in modern controlling. Just kind of think that somewhere down the line we progressed to the project, we progressed in the project, and that we moved into modern controlling, and this is what we would be doing. Okay, because now we're going across. All right, so plan scope management. Now this is very similar to the project management plan that we talked about, but it's geared towards scope only. Okay, so the project management plan has all of the plans, but here we're looking at developing only the scope piece, meaning we're only trying to focus in how we're going to manage scope on our project. Notice I'm saying how we're going to manage scope. And so therefore, when we're done, we'll have our scope management plan, but we're trying to focus in on that. You can see here, it's looking at how do we prevent and deal with scope creep. As I stated, scope creep is, it gets scope that's added on, usually unbeknownst to you. Usually when I find out about scope creep, what has happened is the customer may circumvent the change control process and, kind of jump over the project manager and goes right to one of our developers and say, can you add this? Right? So that's scope creep, right? Because they're adding scope to our project, which extends our project. It would cost our project more money. And we'll, as a project manager, we're going, what's going on? And then eventually find out, hey, the customer added this. And, that happens more often than you think. So sometimes we have to go, okay, you can't do that. We have to keep in line and in vision of what we need. Now, there's also something called gold plating, which is also kind of a little bit of a scope creep as well, but it's not on the customer side. I see gold plating when I'm working with developers who are developing software, and they get into a rhythm and they're adding all kinds of functionality that the customer did not ask for, but they thought it was cool, that it works really great. So they're adding basically what we call freebies, where you get why it's called gold plating. So a couple of things happens during that time when your developers are gold plating. One, if they've created something very innovative, basically we just gave it away to a customer, right? We could have made money on it. So that's a huge thing, especially if it's, like I said, it's very innovative. But the other piece of it, which is more what happens, is they get in there and they add all kinds of functionality, and then we go in not knowing what happened, and we execute it, and it crashes the system. And we go, what happened? So we have to back out of the system and try to redo it. So basically you get defects and you get repairs and, all kinds of costly things. And even though that's technically costing your company money, they try to gold plate it, right? So it is important for us to talk with our team members to make sure, when they're, if the customer comes to you, make sure you push back and tell them to come talk to the project manager. 2, don't add anything that nobody asked for, because that's a freebies, right? Your customer's losing things, but more or less you're adding risk to our project that we didn't ask for. All right, so that's part of the scope creep, gold plating, handling the changes, as having some type of escalation path on any disagreements, especially when it comes to stakeholders. As a project manager, we do try to make sure that we have try to get to a win-win solution with competing ideas and competing requirements with stakeholders, but sometimes things get a little hairy and it's kind of out of our control. And so therefore we may have to escalate to the project manager, or sorry, project sponsor, or, somebody even above them sometimes, to make a decision on, what are we going to do? And so don't be afraid to escalate as needed. We also have the process of creating our scope statement, creating our WBS, and we're also going to document how our deliverables will be accepted. How do we know we're done, and how do we have an acceptance criteria based off of that, so that the customer can't change their mind. All right. The first one is plan scope management. And you can see that it is about that plan, how we're going to manage the project, right? How we're going to manage that scope. And so therefore, some of the inputs into this process, you see here we have the project management plan, project charter, our EEFs and our OPAs. Tools and techniques look pretty similar: expert judgment, data analysis, meetings, and then the outputs, you see we have our scope management plan and our requirements plan. So let's look at the details a little bit, or talk about them. So in the project management plan, we don't necessarily need all of the project management plans, and if this is the first time you're doing the scope management. You may not have these items because you haven't gotten to that process yet, but keep in mind when you need to refine your scope management, that's where these projects come in. Meaning, basically, when we talk about the plans, you're going to be defining the plans at first because that's what you do. But once you add another plan, you may have to go back and refine those plans. And so here's a perfect example. So the project management plan that we would need for scope management is the quality management plan. Well, technically, we have not even looked at the quality management. We haven't gotten to quality management. So when we get to quality management, you will need to come back and refine your scope management plan. Does that make sense? So that's one of the things we'll have to do is when we get to a section, we have to come back and refine the other sections. Some of the other things that we would need is the project lifecycle description and the development approach. How are we going to do our scope? So that's all part of that project management plan. The enterprise rights and input, bringing those in. The EEFs, you're looking at, the culture of the organization you're working with, the infrastructure, personnel administration, maybe marketplace conditions, depending on your project. So those are key there. Then your OPAs, you're looking at policies and procedures in handling scope, also historical information and lessons learned from other projects. It also has the project charter here, which I skipped over accidentally, so I apologize. The project charter does have a scope statement to help you, even though you're going to refine it, but it does have, the vision of what we need and what we're expecting for the project. Tools and techniques. We have our expert judgment. Again, we're looking for somebody who may has experience in that particular project and understands the scope and that they can help you plan out the scope. Also, anybody who has information on either the industry, the discipline, or application area that can help you, right? So you're looking at somebody, let's say you're working on, you're building a building and you're wanting to add your air conditioner piece to it. Well, you would need somebody who is an expert in air conditioning who can help you figure out what that scope looks like. Data analysis. Currently, we're looking at alternative analysis, especially when it comes to ways of collecting requirements. So, we just need to look at different alternatives to the scope. And then meetings, having meetings about scope and working with the scope.
May I ask about the scope management? Like the experts, I'm assuming those are in-house. What if this skill is required outside, and then there's a cost related to that?
Mm-hmm.
How does that fit in? Is it exploratory project or something along those lines that authorizes it?
It depends, right? Okay, so for the most part, it'll probably be in-house. All right, so, but let's say to give you an example, your company is implementing a new software into their organization and nobody has any training on it.
Right.
Right. So part of that is us understanding that, hey, we don't have the expertise on this, right? Because nobody has it. So yeah, that would be part of it, and we probably add that to our cost management once we get to it. Understand that, hey, we've got to hire somebody to come in to help us plan out the scope and maybe even participate in executing some of that, because until our team gets trained and they get comfortable with the software, we're going to be lost. So that's a potential, and you would probably write that down, that we need to hire experts in that field.
Okay, cool. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. So our outputs will have our scope management plan. Notice that it has the process for preparing the detailed statement of scope, how we're going to do it, right? Remember, the plan is how we're going to manage scope. So obviously we're going to talk about processes of how we're going to do it, process that enables the creation of the work breakdown structure, how to establish the WBS and how we're going to maintain it and get it approved, because that's the process, and even how the formal acceptance of the completed project deliverables will be attained, right? So it's all about the process. Now you also have the requirements management plan. Now, if you look on page 25, we have a process under scope management, and then in the planning process that says collect requirements. Well, we need a, well, not for everything, but for a very large project, you would need a requirements management plan, a way for you to manage the requirements. And you can see here it's about how the requirements and activities will be planned, tracked, and reported. So that's a plan. The configuration management activities, requirements prioritization process, well, how are we going to, for instance, we have the product backlog. Well, how are we going to prioritize that? Technically, we would have a planning session or a grooming session for the product backlog, but we would step through what that looks like so that everybody has an expectation of how that prioritization will take place. The product metrics that will be used and the rationale for using them, meaning how do we tell that we have scope creep and how do we measure that? And so having those metrics would be also important. Not scope, I'm sorry, requirements. How do we know we fulfilled the requirements? Okay, so we planned out our scope. We planned out the scope management. And then the second step, or the second activity right underneath it, so once we plan that out, we collect our requirements. And collecting the requirements is about utilizing the project charter, which has high-level requirements, defining those a little bit further, adding clarity, and then refining them, and then adding other requirements that we may not have captured, in initiating, because you're not going to capture everything. It should be in planning, where you have experts, you have people who understand the project, who can help facilitate requirements gathering. Now, I do want to talk a little bit about all the tools and techniques for collecting requirements. It's important that you just don't do like interviews and gather requirements that way. There's all kinds of ways to gather requirements, and you should utilize quite a few different ways to gather it. According to PMI, don't exhaust just one, exhaust a few, because that way you have a good, clear idea of what the requirements are needed. And you can see the outputs for this one. So let's talk about it in further detail. So we have our project charter. As I stated, we're taking the high-level requirements that are in the project charter and we're defining them and refining them. Our project management plan. Now, remember I told you that, we don't have, we don't have at least one of these project management plans that I'm going to talk to you about. But we do have two. The first two are the scope management plan, which we just completed in scope management, as well as the requirements management plan, right? Those were outputs of plan scope management. So they're going to be an input into this process. But we also have our stakeholder management plan, which we haven't gotten to the stakeholders. It's the last knowledge area. Now we're only on the second knowledge area right now, and it's number 10. Stakeholder management is number 10. So we haven't even got there yet. So that means we have to once we get to stakeholder management and we create that plan, we'll have to come back and refine the requirements. All right, so that's why it's important for us to define and refine as we progress through the planning process. Now, the project documents you'll have, you'll need the assumption logs, lessons learned from other projects, and a stakeholder register. Right, so those are some of the documents you would need for this input. You'll also have your business documents. In particular, you're looking at probably your business case, right, to come in, because your business case would have some requirements. Then agreements, contracts do have requirements in them, and we have to fulfill those requirements. So obviously that'll be an input. Enterprise environmental factors, we're looking at same thing, the culture, infrastructure, personnel administration, as well as marketplace conditions. For the OPAs, policies and procedure your company has into collecting requirements, any templates they may have, historical information. All of that would be part of those inputs into this process. So tools and techniques, you got expert judgment, right? So expert judgment, people who, such as your business analyst, who understand how to collect requirements, the requirements, elicitation, interviewing, just asking people about requirements, analyzing those requirements, as well as diagram techniques, facilitation, and conflict management. All of those would be part of the expert judgment. And the reason why I'm mentioning conflict management is, even though you should be able to handle most of the conflict, sometimes it's good to get somebody outside of the project to be able to address conflict. Data gathering, you have brainstorming, you have interviews, you have focus groups, you have questionnaires and surveys, and benchmarking that can help you to gather any type of data and collect those requirements. Next, we have data analysis. Now, the data analysis, you're going to be using some documents where you're analyzing the documents for this to see if there's any requirements, such as, we talked about the agreements, but any business plans your company may have, any business processes, current process flows, any types of rules, business rules that may be impacted, problem and issue logs, policies and procedures, use cases. All of those are part of data analysis. Now, decision making. For decision making, we're looking at voting, people doing, the majority, unanimity, and, people just trying to take a vote on how they want to approach the requirements or collect the requirements. Data representation, we're looking at potentially using affinity diagrams and mind mapping. So those are two types of documents that you can use to help you with data representation. Interpersonal skills, you have the nominal group techniques, as well as observation and conversation, meaning we, to give you an example, maybe you're at a launch party, and you hear end users talking about what type of requirements they would like to see. So that's part of that observation, and maybe even having some conversations with the end users, as well as facilitation is also part of the interpersonal and team skills. Facilitations such as having joint application design sessions, we call them JAD sessions, quality functional deployments, as well as, working with user stories. That's all part of that. If you want to know what a context diagram looks like, it's on page 146. So it allows you to document it out. You can see it's It depicts the product scope by showing the business system and processes and equipment and other systems that are needed. So it gives you a good diagram of what context diagram can help you with collecting requirements. The purpose of a context diagram is to help people to think through the process and think about what type of requirements are going to be. So it gives them kind of a jumping off point and looking through that. You also have prototypes. A lot of people use prototypes to collect requirements, and make changes to the prototypes as needed. Outputs, you have your requirements documentation. You can see here all the different types of requirements documentation that you would have, as well as the requirements traceability matrix, right? So those are the two main outputs of the requirements. All right, so if you want to take a look at page 149, there is a requirements traceability example. So it has things such as, ID, associated ID, the requirements. I'm trying to see. The writing is so tiny. Business need opportunities. It has project objectives, work breakdown structure, deliverables, product design, product development, and test cases. So it has quite a bit of information for the requirements. So just let me know when you're back. You can do it in the chat.
Yep,
Okay.
this is great.
All right.
Yes, Carol is ready.
Okay, and Gail says she's back too. All right, looks like we're just missing one person. All right, so gang, while we're waiting for, oh, he's already joining. While we're stopping right here for a moment, I think we may get a little bit done early today. I'd like to, while time management is usually a little bit more lengthy, I don't really want to get into it and then stop midway. So after we're done with scope management, I think, depending on where we're at, I may release you a little early today, because we're far ahead than I anticipated. So, which I'm fine with. And also Friday, what we're trying to do is reserve Friday, because they have a mock exam that you're going to be taking on Friday, which is 4 hours in the morning ish. So we have to make time for that and then cover some of the questions that you may have. So I'm trying to get through everything, but time management, like I said, is kind of it is a little time consuming, but it's also very kind of technical on some things, and I want to make sure that we have we keep it together, if you will, instead of splitting it up. But we'll see where we're at as we progress. Okay, so next is defining scope, right? So far we have planned our scope management plan. We've collected our requirements. So the next step is to define our scope, right? So what we're doing here, as you can see here, is process of creating a detailed description of the project and the product. So notice it says and product. So maybe your project is to create a computer. And so think about everything, all the different scope or description you could use for your computer. I'm using a laptop right now, so it has a certain screen size, has a certain keyboard, trackpad, as well as everything that goes inside it. What type of operating system, what type of RAM, CPU, and so forth. I can't think of everything else that goes into a computer, but you get my drift. All of those would be part of defining scope. What we want, what kind of, screen size do we want? What type of CPU processor that we want? What type of RAM, and how much of the hard drive do we want? those are all descriptions of what a computer would be, right? And so that's what we're trying to do here, and that's for the product. But for your project, you're also defining what you're going to be using, what's part of your scope of your project as well, right? What, you're thinking about those boundaries, what you're going to do, just not the product, but what's going to be happening in your project. So the inputs for this, oops, gosh dang it, there we go. Make sure I'm on the right page. And the inputs, as you can see here, and we'll talk about them in more detail. So the inputs, your project management plan. In particular, for the project management plan, you're looking at potentially all of the projects management plans. And the reason why I'm saying that is because of the fact that if you have, let's say, a certain quality, right? So when we get into quality management, that would be something that we would bring into here, because that would be part of scope. How we're going to handle risk on our project, that might be part of the project scope versus the product scope. So all of those. But we also have our project charter, because we know that it has a high level definition and a description of our scope. Remember, it has a soft boundary. We're trying to put a hard boundary around it. The project documents, we have the assumption log, requirements documentation, your risk register. Those are the types of documents that you would bring into defining your scope, because it helps you to understand the scope. Enterprise environmental factors, these are the same basic ones. You have your organizational culture in the EEFs, the infrastructure, personnel, administration, marketplace conditions. Those are all your EEFs. For your OPA, we're looking at policies and procedures regarding scope. Are there any templates that help you to develop scope on your project? Do you have project files and lessons learned? So those are all types of inputs you're looking for. Now, here it talks about tools and techniques. The first one is expert judgment, and we're looking again for that expert who can help you to develop your scope. So they kind of helped us with, it'll be the same people that helped us define our scope management plan that can help us with this as well. Then we have data analysis. In particular, you might be looking at alternatives, doing an alternative analysis to help you to think, well, for instance, do we buy something off the shelf or do we make it? That's kind of an alternative. Make or buy decisions are sometimes alternative, right? So we have that. We have decision making, which we talked about, interpersonal and team skills. In particular, you're looking at, having, facilitation, help, because you need to be able to have some workshops to talk about scope and what's defined as your scope. So having those workshops, working sessions, and you're having it with those key stakeholders. Then you have the which is not included here, I'm not seeing it, the product analysis, right? So the product analysis, since it's part of our scope, we want to include the product breakdown, requirements analysis, system engineering, value analysis, value engineering. All of those are part of that product analysis. So it helps us to kind of have a better understanding of what type of product we're building. And then our outputs are, we have, whoops, sorry about that. That was my phone. It finally decided to kick in. So for our project scope statement, you'll see that we're going to be talking about the product scope description, the acceptance criteria, how do we know we've met scope, and what's the acceptance criteria that will get approved by our stakeholders, the deliverables and assumptions. So that's all built into that scope statement. Scope statement, when we think about it, sometimes people think it's just a paragraph, but it could be bullet points as well. Basically, you're just putting it in words that will clearly define what your scope is. Then we have the project documents. You see that we have our stakeholder registry, the requirements documentation, and requirements traceability to help us, or not to help us, but it will be an output of this. We're going to be updating those. Next, we have create our WBS. You guys, I think we're going to still get to time management. I didn't realize we're going so fast. So we may have to, we'll talk about it when we get there. Okay, so create WBS. So WBS stands for work breakdown structure. Okay, so it stands for work breakdown structure. And basically, a work breakdown structure at a high level takes the deliverables and it decomposes it down to manageable activities, or AKA tasks, to help us to be able to figure out what we need to do. It doesn't put them in order, all right? That's a network diagram, but it does allow us to understand the scope of the work for each of the deliverables. So like I said, it's just breaking it out to manageable components, breaking things down to a smaller level. If you work in MS Project, when you have a summary task and you indent another task below it, and you know how it comes bold, that is a work breakdown structure. Sometimes when outlines, right? So you see here we have 5.4, and then we have a 5.4.1. That's kind of an outline, and basically that's a work breakdown structure as well. Most of the work breakdown structures are, you can look at them and they look like cards. So or a org chart. So it could be as simple as working it in your MS Project and indenting it, creating a outline where there's numbers 4.5.4.1 and so forth, or it could be graphical, which we're going to take a look at. I think we have examples. So the create work breakdown structure inputs. Well, as you see, we need our project management plan. And that is all of them, right? So technically, we haven't even got to the other ones yet. So what does that mean to you? That means at this point, if you're just starting out, you would define it. And then when you get into schedule management, you come back and refine it. When you get into cost management, you come back and refine your work breakdown structure. And quality, same thing, all the way down to stakeholder management. You would come back and refine it every time you add something new, because that's what will happen. You have your project documents. In particular, you'll have your scope statement and your requirements documentation. You have your EEFs. Again, we're looking at anything such as industry specific to your project. You have your OPAs, policies and procedures, any type of templates, and lessons learned. Okay, so you heard me use the term decomposition. So as you can see here, it's identifying and analyzing the deliverables and related work, structuring it and organizing it in a WBS, and decomposing the upper WBS into lower level detail components. That's the bullet point you need to understand decomposition. It's like that joke, how do you eat an elephant? And the punchline is one bite at a time. So that's what decomposition is we take something that's really big, right? And we break it down into smaller and smaller components until we get to a place where we go, oh, these are the activities, aka tasks, that we need to do to get to this deliverable, right? So you break it down till you get to that piece. Expert judgment. Expert judgment, as you can see here, is based on application knowledge, area, discipline of the scope, right? Your team members, those folks that are doing the work would be able to help you. So, but you also need to look at the skill and training and specialized education. That's the expert, right? How do they help you with doing scope? I'm sorry, work breakdown structure. So this is an example of a work breakdown structure. Now they only broke down the first deliverable, which is called a needs assessment. All right, but you see that they have other deliverables. So in the needs assessment, they broke it down. Notice it now says 1.1.1, the current audit, and then it breaks it down further. All right, so they're kind of showing you things to do. Now under this last layer, like this, here, let's do a gap assessment. So under this last layer, that is called a work package, the last one, right? So we break it down to a work package. Your work package would have items such as the activities that we're going to be doing, aka tasks. It would include the description of those tasks, when they're due, how long it's going to take. So basically what we call activity attributes. So this is a work package. Underneath there, like I said, you would have activities listed underneath it. All right, I believe we have another example. Here's another one of a product release. So notice that you have planning here because it falls under project management. And basically, this is your work package planning. And then you could probably list all of the activities under the planning that you want to include off of page 25, because those are all activities, aka processes. So that would be included, but you would include duration as well as, you know, when we're going to start it, when we're going to stop it, and so forth. And here's another example. Now, I believe that these down here could possibly be broken out even further, right? So like I said, we just keep breaking them out until we get to a level where we can assign tasks. All right. There's also, if you want to look, there's also some examples. Well, I think they're the same examples. Yeah, it looks like they are the same examples. But they're in the PMBOK, page 158, 159, and 160. They're the same examples that we saw in the presentation. So our outputs, well, when we're done, we're going to have our scope baseline. And notice in the scope baseline, and we'll have our project scope statement, which includes our WBS dictionary, and these are all the items that go into the WBS dictionary. And I'm not sure if I can highlight all those, but I will try. So as you see here, it has a lot in there into the description of work, the assumptions, constraints, resource required, the cost estimate. It also should have time estimate, but there's a schedule of milestones though as well. So it has everything you need to be able to do the work, and that's why it's called a work breakdown structure dictionary. So it has all of that information. All right. Then we'll also have as an output is updates to our project documents. In particular, you can see here it's the requirements documentation. So I'm going to stop right there and see if you have questions for the WBS. Has anybody done the WBS?
I have not.
I have not. Okay. So you've not seen these org charts type of thing.
Correct. Yeah, this is the first time I've seen something like.
Okay. Well, I know you probably worked in MS Project, and it works the same way. It's just it's indented. So so basically, you would have this would be the project name, and then you would indent it and say this is project management. Then you would indent, and then it would have these two, and you just keep indenting it till you get to a place where you can add tasks that people are actually going to be assigned to. Does that make sense?
It does, yes. Thank you.
Okay. One of
Are
the
there standard templates of this for different
template?
industries of that?
Actually, there is a book. PMI has a WBS book that gives you kind of a standard of those, but there are templates out there. You can go out to, basically, you probably could Google just about any industry to see if there's any type of template that you can use. So yeah,
Excellent.
there's
I like
yeah,
reviews.
there's okay. Yeah, me too. I always do a little research and it's like, oh, hey, look, there's a project charter somewhere to mine. Okay, yeah, and I do the same thing with the WBSs. But there's also a kind of a team building exercise you can do. When you guys are all together. Obviously, for COVID, it's a little impossible to do this. But when your team's all together, you can do what's called the Post-it game. And basically, you line out what the deliverables are. You and your team say, hey, these are the deliverables. And then you let them do Post-its and write down quickly as much as you can, okay? In training, what kind of things do we need to do for training? And you let them write them down as fast as they can on Post-it notes. And then you literally post it onto the wall, and it would look similar to this. You and your team would just organize all those items together. And it's a team building exercise, but it also has people thinking outside of the box because you build to organize. Okay, well, what goes into equipment training? Well, you have to have some type of logistics, how you're going to do the training, what subject's going to be the trained, who's going to be the, contact the trainer, schedule the trainer. Those are all types of activities you would do for training. So, you and your team would come up with that list, and you would also get a list of what we call activities. So it says activity list. So I think I think there's a YouTube video on how to do it. There used to be. I'm not sure if there still is. It's been quite a while. But it's, like I said, it's a great tool to help your team kind of bond together as well. But it's called the Post-it game. Okay, so everything that we've discussed so far in scope management was all in planning. All right, so if you think about it, we planned out our scope management, we collected our requirements, we defined our scope statement, and then we created our WBS, right? So what happens from there? Well, we would continue on with the rest of the planning and then come back and refine those items as we add more to it. So meaning when we get to, we would move into time management, right? And once we have that developed, we would go back and refine scope management, right? So it's define and refine, always that thing until you get all the way through the planning process. And then you go, okay, we are through with our planning process. We are going to baseline our scope. And then that moves you guys out of the planning process. Then your team is executing what you planned out. And then as project managers, we are getting deliverables from our team because they're executing those deliverables and producing them. And we move into what we call monitoring and controlling. And the first thing is validate scope. Okay, so validate scope, and I'm going to highlight a word because this is key. When you validate scope, you're gaining acceptance from your customer, the person who you're providing the deliverable to. You're gaining their acceptance. So validate scope, I see this like as like a walkthrough of a house that you built, you know, and you're giving them acceptance for it. I see this as user acceptance training for those who are in IT, not training, testing, user acceptance testing in IT, the IT world. So it's about the customer going in, checking, and making sure, is this what we really wanted? Right, and doing all that with it. So when you can see from the outputs, when we're done, we'll have accepted deliverables, but also notice we will also have change requests, because what if a deliverable isn't accepted? Well, guess what will happen? We'll have a change to it, right, to see how it works. And so we would go through that process. So let's get into the details of validate scope. Remember, it's about acceptance. Validate scope is about acceptance. Okay, so what do we need for our inputs? Well, we need our project management plan. In particular, you need your scope management plan, your requirements management plan, and your scope baseline. Right, so what you're trying to do is making sure, hey, is everything in scope when we receive this? Because we're preparing to validate and gain acceptance. Remember, scope is about doing all and only the work that is required. Right, so when we validate scope, we don't have anything gold plated. You know, our developers didn't add new functionality. We're not giving them freebies. So we are giving them all and only the work that they requested. And so that's why the scope baseline is important. The project documents, you have things that, like your lessons learned, your quality reports, requirements documentation, as well as your requirements traceability matrix. Then we have verified deliverables, meaning that the customer did their walkthrough, they did their testing on their end, and they go, you know, we verified. Oh, actually, let me back up. That's not right. Forget I said that. Validate scope is about gaining the acceptance. Verified deliverables, okay? Verified deliverables come out of executing. Your team, okay, your team is the one that has verified the deliverables, meaning they've done the testing, right? So they went out and tested, make sure the application that they've created is working. They've done all their tests. The people who are building the house have done their own walkthrough before the customer does it, and they've verified everything looks accordingly to the plan. So it's been verified by you and your company. So I apologize for the mix-up. Okay, so that's why that's an input, because it comes out of executing, because that was part of executing, doing the testing, doing the walkthroughs on our end to verify that the deliverables that we're getting ready to hand over to the customer to test on their end are good, right? Okay, so that's why it's verified. Then we have work performance data, and we know that's that raw data that we need for measurements. Okay, so tools and techniques. We have inspection. All right, so inspection. So this is where we're measuring, examining, and validating the work, and it is the customer that is doing that inspection, that they're doing the testing, they are doing the walkthrough on their end, and they're doing those items. And decision making. If it's a group of users, you know, they will potentially get together and talk about if they're going to accept it. Meaning, let's say you have a high rise you just built and you're doing your final walkthrough, or you're doing a walkthrough, and there may be a group of people instead of just one person, and there would have to be some type of decision making. Outputs. We will have accepted deliverables. So remember, validate scope is about gaining that acceptance, and therefore we would have deliverables. But we will also have change requests because of the fact, whoops, my phone's going off. Our change requests because there's maybe some deliverables that need to be corrected. So we'll have a change request for those. We'll have work performance information because we are in modern controlling and we took that raw data, so we analyzed it. Now we have our work performance information because we're going to be utilizing that to create our reports. And we will have also our project documents, which include things such as lessons learned, requirements documentation, as well as the requirements traceability matrix. All of those documents will be updated. All right, then next we have control scope. Now remember, the validate scope is about gaining acceptance. Control scope is about what we do as project managers to make sure that we don't have scope creep or gold plating. So we're monitoring the status of the project and product scope and managing the change to our baseline. Okay, so one's about the customer, another one's about us doing our job and making sure that we're keeping things within scope. Okay, so let's take a look at the details. Okay, so we have our project management plan. You can see here we have the scope baseline, scope management, change management, configuration management, and the requirements management plan. And that's the inputs that we're going to be utilizing because, like I said, we're controlling and measuring and, you know, making sure that we are within the scope of our project. And so that's why those items are important into this process. The project documents, you can see here the requirements should be unambiguous, meaning they're measurable, they're testable, that we can trace them, we can figure out are they complete. And so that's why the requirements documentation will be important for controlling scope, because we're going to use those measurables to help us to see if everything's within scope. We will be gathering work performance data. For our project. So because we are measuring the performance of our project, therefore we'll have that data. Then we'll have organizational process assets. And the types of organizational process assets is, you know, maybe we're looking for an existing formal or informal scope control related policies and procedures that will help us and guide us. And maybe how are we going to report, right? What type of reporting methods does your company have when it comes to controlling your scope? Next, we have tools and techniques. Now, the first tool and technique is the data analysis. It's the only one, by the way, sorry, because we're doing those measurements. So we're looking at a variance analysis as well as trend analysis. You know, what was planned versus what's actual, looking for that variance, and then trending. Is there anything that's trending that would have us do some type of change or corrective action, or preventative action, not change, corrective, preventative action. And so that's why the data analysis, variance and trend analysis will help us, because we may have corrective and preventive actions. So the outputs, well, you can see here, first we have our work performance information. So we've gathered the data, we took the data, we analyzed it, and now we have information. As you see, there are some of the things is how many changes were received, how we identified the scope variances and their causes. That would be information, how they impacted our schedule and our cost, and how what we can do about forecasting out. Are we still going to be remaining within scope? Change requests. You see your change request will be an output, especially when it comes to when we're measuring the progress of our scope is do we have scope change? And if we, or not scope change, but scope creep. And if we do, what do we do about that? That would be preventative and corrective action. Any defects, repairs, as I stated, when the customer does user acceptance testing from Validate Scope, they may go, hey, this is a defect, we want it repaired. Any enhancements requests, again, that's change control and a change request. You know, hey, we do like this, but we'd like to make it a little bit better, and so therefore it would be enhanced. Then you have updates to your project management plans. Notice it's just updating the baselines, mainly the scope baseline, but you could potentially update the other baselines that you have. And then you see the project document updates, the requirements documentation, as well as the requirements traceability matrix.